Hello and welcome to the Big Yearning podcast. We are two life coaches who really enjoy meaningful discussions about big questions. Our work and our lives have been very much shaped by these questions, and they've taken us to some amazing places in our lives and within ourselves. We all long for things. We all carry big yearnings in our hearts. And over the next hour or so, we hope to touch on some of these yearnings and perhaps give you some ideas or insights to help you be clearer about what you long for and how to get it. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 13 of the Big Yearning podcast. My name's Neil.
And my name's Alexander.
And yes, a very warm welcome to everyone listening today. For those of you who have listened to us before, welcome back. And for any new listeners, a particularly warm welcome to you. If through listening to this podcast you like what you hear, please do pass it on to people. Please do let people know about the podcast and what me and Alexander are doing. We very much appreciate feedback from listeners. And actually today's topic is anger, and that is actually a request from a listener. So we're going to be exploring the whole topic of anger in this episode. But before we do that, we check in. Alexander, how are you today?
Thanks, Neil. I'm pretty good, thank you. I've had some real highs and real lows since the last time we sat down together and did this. I think, well, when I say lows, I think that the lows are just the results of the lockdown. We are still in our second lockdown in the UK, and I think that's just caused a little bit of extra pressure and a little bit of wanting to spend more time with my closest friends and family, beginning to look at how on earth I can get down to Plymouth, which is where my family are, for Christmas. And it turns out that public transport prices have sort of doubled this Christmas. And so I'm trying to work out how I can get down there in an affordable way, and some just sort of background worries. So I think I've been finding myself not sleeping as well for the last few nights. But I'm also trying to remember to forgive myself for that. If I'm going to be a bit slower some days, if I'm going to get less done, if I'm going to be a little bit less productive, then just trying to understand that this is what we're going through. We're all in this, and it's going to be challenging. So just forgiving myself for that as much as I can, and also noticing I'm putting on a little bit of weight. Can't get out and exercise as much as I normally do. I can't spend the time in the gym that I normally do, and I have been treating myself to quite a lot of sort of tasty food. So noticing a little bit of spread around the tummy, but strangely, I'm okay with that this time. In the summer, I was really eager to try and maintain my weight, and this time I don't mind that much. I know that when this lifts, I'll be straight back in the gym. I'll be lifting weights. I'll be doing cardio. I know I'll shift it, and I'm okay with it. It's fine with me this time. And I think the really positive things happened for me is a thing I did for myself, which is I've rediscovered journaling in a really big way. And I just sort of remembered how beneficial that is for me. I think being present and being really aware of what I'm experiencing and reflecting on it properly, it really helps me bring me into the moment and just experience my life in a really full way. And that is one of my big yearnings, to be present, to be fully here. And so I've been writing. I find that when I write things down, it sort of allows me to get that bit out of my head so I can do the next bit in the thought process. It sort of stops me ruminating and reflecting and going around in circles in my head. I just get to stuff the stuff out on paper, know that it's written down, and then it seems to leave more space for new ideas in my mind. So I've just been sitting down and writing there. I've got a really nice pen and a nice pad that I've got together, and it feels like a really lovely experience when I do it. And I've just found myself sort of walking along the seafront here in Brighton and just noticing the light reflecting on the waves and saying hello to dogs as they pass, which is, I think, a really important thing to do. And yes, so just being way more appreciative of the moments and of the days as they go by. So really glad that I've got back into journaling. And I suppose the other thing worth mentioning is I have a PR guy, I have a marketing guy, and we've been having some really interesting conversations about what the next couple of years are going to look like in terms of launching myself much more fully into the sort of public sphere in terms of my coaching and my book and other things I intend to do. And yesterday I shared my 5-year plan with a close friend, and I had his reflections, but I was also able to hear myself talking about these really ambitious, exciting, cool things that I've got planned for the next few years. And that felt it felt real. It made it sort of feel like I'm actually going there. It's going to happen. I'm committed to it. I have these ambitions. I have these yearnings. I have these longings, and I am going to get out there and make them happen. Yeah, broadly, I'm in a very positive place, and in the places where I feel struggling, perhaps a little bit, thanks to the lockdown, I'm just trying to accept and forgive that. So that's where I am. How are you doing, mate?
Thank you very much, Alexander. That's lovely to hear that you've rediscovered journaling, and that's a thing to kind of help you be more present. That's really, really great.
It has been great, yeah.
I too am generally well, in spite of having toothache. Toothache developed on Saturday, and I went into a bit of a downward spiral about it. I have really bad associations with dentists and toothache stemming from around about the age of 6 when I was hauled into the school dentist. And so whenever I have toothache and think about the dentist, then, a lot of kind of really bad memories kind of flood me, So I had a bit of a down day around that on Saturday. But then really interestingly, I kind of consciously sort of took hold of myself and sort of separated the reality of the toothache, which is in actuality quite mild, from the story of Neil and his teeth and the dentists, which I was really proud of being able to do. I don't always do that. Usually I kind of, the reality and the story just kind of combine in some sort of awful, messy lump and just drags me down. So I was really pleased to kind of get some sort of rational, adult, sort of conscious sort of take on things. Really pleased with myself. And phone the dentist. Dentist might not be able to see me till later on the week, but again, that was good. And that kind of leads me into another thing that's quite up for me at the moment in terms of avoidance. I have this tendency to avoid things. I'm a notorious pusher under the carpet of things. And so going towards something like the toothache and getting help rather than just sort of, trying to ignore it or think it will go away. Again, that's me changing a way of behaving. And then I had a really, really lovely thing happen to me, which I've spoken to you about yesterday, I think, or the day before. I got a random email in my inbox a couple of weeks ago from an American coach asking to kind of hook up to get some support and share ideas, specifically around the area of narrative coaching, which is something I'm really into and kind of base my practice on. And I was a little bit skeptical, thinking, is this genuine? Is someone just trying to sell me something or whatever? But as it transpired, we had a lovely conversation, and a friend of hers joined me in the call. We talked about a whole range of things. And on the back of that, I signed up for an online course led by this guy, David Drake, who invented narrative coaching, to start in January. And also really important in that is me finding some community, some like minds to kind of talk about coaching with, and I'm sure other stuff as well. So there's a kind of lesson for me there in terms of being open to stuff that comes towards me. I'm very much trying to do that rather than sort of negatively or cynically kind of shut things down. So that's a really nice development for me. So it's really important for my learning as well. When I did the coaching course last year, I hadn't been in a learning situation as a student for many, many years. And just really, really noticed how much I really enjoyed that, the stimulation of it, the ideas, the vibrancy. So really looking forward to that in January. Yes, so that's me checking in.
Very cool, mate. I love that story. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, so as I said in the brief introduction, we are going to be looking at the topic of anger today. We are going to be looking at things like what it is. We're going to be sort of deconstructing it a bit, I guess, how we might deal with it in ourselves and when it arises in others in relation to us. But we're going to kick off with you, Alexander, kind of setting the scene in terms of anger and placing it in terms of, or setting the scene and putting it in the context of other emotions in general, if I'm right. Over to you for the first bit.
Okay, thank you, Neil. So I'm going to begin by just talking a little bit about emotions in general, and we'll focus in on anger in a moment. But I just wanted to sort of cover, I think it's a very misunderstood topic. I think a lot of people are aware, of course, that we have feelings, but we don't really know what they are, why they are, how they function, And I think there's a general lack of awareness that you can actively work with your emotions and develop relationships with them so you can transform how they show up in your life, how you respond to that information, and how you use it. So today we're going to be using two different source materials. These are two different authors and different experts on personal development and emotion. I'm primarily going to be drawing on the work of Carla McLaren and her work, The Language of Emotions, and I'll be coming on in a while to talk about what she specifically has to say about anger. Neil is going to be talking about David Richo's work, specifically the book How to Be an Adult. Neil originally introduced me to that book a long time ago, maybe 10 years ago, and I think I've recommended it more than any other book to people. I think it's a wonderful little book. So we're going to be drawing on those two experts today. Just want to begin by saying, okay, so what are emotions? So probably the most important thing to say straight out the gate is they're not thoughts. They're not the mind. Emotions work totally different to the way that thoughts work, and they have different mechanisms. And if we want to have a good relationship with them, we have to separate out our relationship with our mind and with our relationship with our emotions. So what are emotions? Carla McLaren would refer to them as messengers from a deep and wise part of us. And I'll be unpacking what she means by that. But in some ways, it's also true to say that emotions are very primitive. They just do what they do. They show up at specific times. They feel the way that they feel for us, and they will always feel that way. And as a rule, emotions can't respect your mind. They don't care about the situation. They don't care if it's convenient for you to have this feeling. They're just going to show up. So while your mind might go, oh, I probably shouldn't say those sort of things because that's not an appropriate thing to say right now, it's not okay to do that, your emotions are just going to turn up. They can be very predictable. Once we understand what each emotion is for, we know why it's there, we know when it shows up, and we know how to relate to it. They're quite logical when you understand what that emotion's function is, what they're trying to do. And what that means is that each emotion has a specific purpose. It has a reason that it exists within us. Some are there for our absolute survival, some are there to enhance our well-being, and some are there to enhance our connection with others. It's up to us to learn what emotions are, so that we can work with them instead of being confused by them. They do follow logical pathways, they do have predictable patterns of behavior, but most of us don't tend to pay attention to that. We don't have... there's been no stage in our life where someone has sat down and explained to us how emotions work. And so we just sort of are aware that feelings happen. And when they pop up, sometimes they can be distracting or confusing. But this is something absolutely you can work with. Yeah? We can develop relationships with these things. We can understand them. We can predict them. We can receive the wisdom that they bring us and make use of it. Each emotion usually has a physical embodiment. Sometimes we feel hot, sometimes we feel cold, sometimes it's in our tummy, sometimes it's sort of a tightness in the throat, sometimes it's a tightness or a heat in the head. So if we think about anger, or if we think about fear or grief or anxiety, we can often immediately think, where does that appear in my body? When I'm angry, where do I tend to feel? Do I feel like a tightness and a heat in my chest? Do I feel something squirming in my tummy? And that's quite important. That's another way that we can make this a multi-dimensional relationship with our emotions. So it is important to get used to the way that these things embody. Now, as a rule, we tend to want to search to have some feelings more and other feelings less. Like we want to feel happy and joyful and at peace a lot. And we want to feel, as a rule, sad and anxious and angry less often. We tend to want some feelings and we don't tend to want other feelings. And we tend to do this kind of complicated dance where we try and amplify some feelings, give ourselves more experiences that give those, and we tend to want to suppress others. But unfortunately, what an awful lot of research shows is emotions are a job lot. If you're going to have feelings, you're going to feel them all. And at their most healthy, emotions flow. Emotions arise when they are called, when they have something important to tell you, when they are triggered. They deliver something to you, and if we acknowledge them, and if we appreciate what that core message is, then they flow on, and they sort of recede back into our unconscious, and then a new emotion might flow and arrive. Carla McLaren, in her book, The Language of Emotions, talks about sadness, for example. That sadness has a particular function, and when we listen to that and appreciate it, it's often followed by happiness and relief and joy. So that's an example of emotions flowing from one state into another. And when we're in a position where we feel sort of emotionally resolved, we're really aware of how things work inside of us, we feel healthy and empowered and in control, we tend to understand what that flow is. We know how the feelings flow within us, and that's enormously empowering. It means that we're no longer kind of knocked off centre by feelings, but we can receive whatever information they have, and it's okay. It doesn't destabilise us. It doesn't confuse us. It doesn't knock us off centre. In our culture, of course, a lot of emotions have a bad rap. Anger, in particular, is often seen as a negative emotion. A client asked me in a session yesterday, why do there seem to be so many more words describing negative feelings than positive ones? I came back and said, well, I don't agree with your categorization. I don't think there are positive and negative emotions. Each emotion just has a function. But it is important also to be aware of this kind of cultural bias, that there will be some feelings that you've been taught are not okay. It's not okay to be sad for too long. It's not okay to express anger. It's not okay if you have grief in your life to sit with that. So I just want to put that to a side if we can while we're having this conversation about anger, and just accept that emotions are a function of the kind of person that we are. They have a purpose, they have a reason, and if we understand that reason, it's an empowering thing rather than something to be ashamed of. So that's my little introduction, and that's how I understand what emotions are.
Great. Thank you, Alexander. That's really clear. Thank you very much. I think I'd like to just follow up on that last bit you said and speak to what my wish for this podcast is. And for me, there's very much something about trying to reclaim anger as something which is healthy and functional in terms of human communication, rather than something to be judged negatively and feared. I very much want to get across that anger is natural and okay and even essential.
Lovely. Yeah.
So,
absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I am going to try to respond to the question, what is anger? So as Alexander said, this is from the work of David Richo and his book, How to Be an Adult. And this is quite sort of simple stuff, really, in many ways. I haven't got a lot to say, but it's more about the depth of what he says and the clarity of what he says, as opposed to me saying a lot about this. So these are kind of pretty much straight out of his book. So his definition of anger, there are three bits to this. Firstly, anger is a natural human feeling that everyone experiences often and that needs to be expressed to maintain psychological health. Anger is a feeling that says no to opposition, injury, or injustice. It is a signal that something I value is in jeopardy. Okay, so there's something there, and I think you might be talking about this a bit later on, Alexander, something about boundaries, a boundary being crossed. So he's very clearly saying that it's essential for psychological health. The next part of his definition refers to the physical aspect of anger. And again, sort of touching on what you were saying about our emotions having a bodily locale or location, Alexander. So Richo says the physical energy of anger comes from the fight side of the flight-fight response of adrenaline. So anger has this core physiological base, again, for me, sort of denoting its naturalness. It's kind of like, if it's there in the body, it's kind of like not false, so there's this notion that the body doesn't lie. So I kind of found that really helpful, in as much as it's almost a visceral kind of body wisdom at play here. And like you were alluding to, Alexander, in your piece, anger is not something to be thought out. It's something which is very much embodied, and we can get to know that, and we can learn from it, and we can trust it. It's a really important part of the jigsaw. And lastly, Richo says, in terms of the definition of anger, the psychological energy of anger comes from the real or imagined sense of threat. Anger is thus legitimately expressed even when its foundation is irrational. We express a feeling because it is real for us, not because it has any objective justification. And I think this bit is really, really important, because I don't know about you, the listeners, and you, Alexander, but I can sometimes get caught up thinking I can't express something because I haven't thought it through. I haven't thought it out. Whereas actually, I find I need to kind of get rid of that imperative that self-imperative sort of thing of I must sort this out, and goes straight to the expression. And I think it's really interesting that he says that even if it doesn't have any objective justification, it's kind of like the feeling, the anger is there, it's in your body, you can't deny it, you can't get rid of it. And it's better to acknowledge that and express it rather than deny its existence. And so for me, there's something there about anger, like any emotion, doesn't exist in the paradigm of right or wrong. Emotions simply are. So that's my piece, or more accurately, David Rico's piece, with a few of my comments added on about what is anger. So just for the listener, I think when I was researching this, really helpful, I think, to really drill down on what exactly is this thing. Yeah. So hopefully that's helpful. Okay, over to you, my friend.
Lovely, Neil. Thank you very much. I think we're beginning to dive into this. This is really good. So I'm going to pick up there with some stuff from Carla McLaren. So as I say, my source material for this one is her book, The Language of Emotions. It's worth mentioning that I think it's currently out of print, but there's plenty of places you can still pick up copies of it. She has newer books that are currently in print. I find The Language of Emotions to be an extraordinary book, and it is something that I would encourage anyone who acknowledges that they need a deeper relationship with their emotions to pick up and dive into. It's a chunky book, it's big, and Carla has a way of writing which is quite verbose. She tends to cover things with quite a lot of words, which is part of the reason it's such a chunky book. But it's a wonderful book. It begins by exploring the question of what are emotions and how do they work and how do they function. And then there's simply a chapter on each emotion. So when I was researching this, I could very easily just skip to the chapter on anger, brush up on what Carla says about it. And I'd like to begin talking here with some quotes from the book. So, Carla says, "If I were to personify anger, I would describe it as a mix between a stalwart castle sentry and an ancient sage. Anger sets your boundaries by walking the perimeter of your soul and keeping an eye on you, the people around you, and your environment. If your boundaries are broken, anger comes forward to restore your sense of strength and separateness. The questions for anger are what must be protected and what must be restored. When your anger flows freely, you won't even know it's there. It will simply help you maintain your boundaries, your inner convictions, and your healthy detachment. Anger also comes forward when you witness others being made vulnerable through injustice or cruelty. Anger is a social emotion in that way. It doesn't want to see anyone getting hurt unnecessarily." So Carla's real focus on anger is this question of boundaries. If we're maintaining clear and conscious and healthy boundaries, we don't tend to get angry very much. And anger will just flare up occasionally when someone encroaches one of our boundaries with something they say or what they do, or when we forget our boundaries and we overstep them. Anger will simply arrive, we'll feel a bit flushed, we'll feel a need to take action, we'll feel the need to say some words. We can acknowledge that messenger and say, "Thank you, I understand, I need to take action now." We take the action that's appropriate, and then once our boundaries are restored, perhaps in a relationship or at work or in the way that we're treating ourselves, then the anger will go away. The problem becomes when we don't acknowledge it, we don't understand why anger is there, and we try to either avoid and suppress, or we get trapped in a cycle of rage and hatred rather than the healthy expression of anger. Anger is a friend and an ally. And when we simply acknowledge it and deal with it as it arises, it doesn't become a big burden. It's not a big disruptive force. It's simply there. It gives us heat. It gives us fire. It gives us passion. It gives us drive in order to make sure that we remain healthy. It's an expression, really, of our positive self-regard for ourselves. It steps forward to protect and guide us and make sure that we're keeping ourselves healthy and whole. Now, quite a lot of us can easily fall into a state in our lives where we don't really have clear boundaries, where we're chasing connection, perhaps, or we have allowed people to ride roughshod all over the things that are most important to us. And that means anger can become quite a continuous companion. It's there often because it's constantly saying, there's something wrong here. So Carla does say that we have these two unhealthy responses. As I said, we either tend to repress and avoid, because we don't feel like our voice is valid. We don't feel like it's okay to take action in this situation, or we think that the action we need to take will be so disruptive and so unacceptable to those around us that it's better to just quash and avoid this unhelpful feeling. And that just tends to mean that anger is there all the time. It's simmering under the surface. It can spike really suddenly and unexpectedly when there is a situation when we can express it, or it can gnaw away at us and be this unhelpful, constant messenger. And we don't really know why it's there. At any given moment, there's no reason for me to feel angry, but I just feel peevish, I feel annoyed, I feel pissed off, and I'm not sure why. The other thing that can happen in different personality types is to settle into anger being a constant expression. So I am constantly enraged. I am constantly hateful. I am channeling my anger towards specific groups in such a consistent way that it becomes saturated into my being, and I am just an angry person. These are both what happens to anger if we don't allow it to flow, acknowledge it, and understand its mechanisms. And it's healthiest. Anger is there to reassure our boundaries, make sure that we are healthy and whole. It flows into our lives. It arrives with a sense of, as I say, usually heat and force and vitality. It delivers its message, and then it flows on once we've acknowledged and restored our boundaries. I'm just going to end with, so in each chapter, Carla also has what questions do we need to ask when this emotion arrives, and what is our practice towards this emotion. So I'm just going to end with her practice towards anger. Channel the fiery intensity of anger into your boundary instead of repressing or exploding with it. Then speak your truth or make your correcting actions. This will reset your boundaries in healthy ways, which will protect you and your relationships. If we can develop that practice when anger comes up, then that's making use of anger, befriending it, and understanding its purpose and its mechanism. If we don't do that, we tend to become trapped, we tend to repress, we tend to avoid, we tend to explode. So that's Carla's take on anger.
Thanks, Alexander. Really, really helpful again. I've just jotted down a few things that you've talked about, and I think in my last piece I will refer to those. Really helpful. Thank you.
Great.
Okay. So I'm going to speak now about a couple of things. How anger is expressed and fear of anger. And the first part, how anger is expressed, for me is really useful in terms of raising self-awareness and recognizing that if any of these things I'm going to list here are going on for you, if you behave in any of these ways, then they're a kind of signal or a bit of a red flag to say to yourself, hey, this ain't good. Maybe I could be doing something differently here in terms of anger expression. So David Richo talks about these following different ways in which anger can be expressed. So firstly, it can be expressed passively, as we know, passive aggressiveness. So this involves, punishing someone without admitting your anger, really, talking behind someone's back, gossiping, going silent on someone, refusing to answer their texts, their phone calls, their emails. It can manifest as a refusal to cooperate. It can manifest as you absenting yourself from an interaction or from a social situation. And it can also manifest in terms of rejection. So those are all ways in which anger is expressed kind of passively in a kind of pent up, indirect way. And I speak from good experience here because this has been my default over many years. And it was only kind of coming into relationship with my current partner that I had a very kind of in your face learning wake up call about this way I was operating. So it's been quite a journey for me. And I think, this is kind of really relevant for me. And I think I like to pat myself on the back here and say that I have made some strides in this. You probably have to ask my partner for the definitive take on that. Okay, so the next thing David Richo has to say is strongly expressed anger is called rage. And then strongly held anger is called hate. And I'll say a bit more about this later. So already we can see, I think, that by what he's saying, by him really drilling down and defining these kind of felt emotions and the words that are associated with them, we can all, I think we can begin to see how anger morphs into these different states, which in common parlance can become conflated. So it's kind of like, well, rage and anger are the same thing, or passive aggressiveness and anger are the same thing. Well, no, they're not. So for me, one of the great things that Rico is doing here, and hopefully we're helping you, the listener, with, is just to separate these things out a bit. He then says that unexpressed anger is resentment. Again, I know that in myself, that's quite close to passive aggressiveness. And lastly, there is a school of thought that says that consciously repressed anger becomes internalized and then becomes depression. There are a lot of people in psychological circles who would contest that, while at the same time there is a kind of strong body of thought which attests to that. So there are some different words, different ways in which anger shows up or is expressed. I'll talk about healthy expression of anger in my final point. So moving on to the fear of anger and why we don't express it, I think this is a really key thing, because listeners may be thinking, yes, all of that stuff is going on for me. I get triggered. This stimulates me. But, why don't I express it? So a couple of things here that Rico says. And basically that centers around, somewhere along the line, often in our childhood, we learn that anger was dangerous. So we may have learned that showing anger in our childhood may have meant no longer being loved or approved of. And we're acting as though that's still true. So we're continuing to play out an old script, if you like. So, me and you, Alexander, we're coaches. Often the work that we do with people is unhooking them from their old stories. So that is very much true here. Something around anger may have been true in your childhood in terms of showing it. But is that the case now? Will you receive the same response as you did, when you were 5 or 6 years old or whatever it is? Equally, Rico talks about receiving anger. And he says that being on the receiving end of it may seem dangerous because previously, again, maybe as a child, this kind of expression has led to violence, either physically or emotionally. But he attests that is not true anger. That is something that he calls drama. And I will spend my last final point talking about that distinction that he draws between true anger and drama. But I'll leave you on tenterhooks there until I get to that point. For now, over to you, Alexander.
Oh, thank you very much, Neil. That was really good. And actually, it's been a helpful reminder for me. I do tend towards the passive-aggressive, I think, when I am truly triggered into anger, because parts of me can feel quite frightened of the anger. It can feel quite overwhelming, and it can primitive and early life parts of me can feel that it's not okay for me to be angry. So I can't express that to someone. If I do that, then something terrible might happen. And so it's better for me just to avoid and to be to be passive aggressive, to avoid some contact for a while, to punish them in little ways until I feel like there's been enough punishment done, and then I can just move on. And that's not what we're talking about in terms of a healthy expression of anger. So that's actually been a very timely reminder for me.
Yeah, listen, I think you're speaking very truthfully there about how challenging this stuff is. Like I said, I have the same pattern of kind of passive aggressiveness and have had to work with it consciously. And, what I just said about the invitation here and the hard work is about, going back to those original historical triggers. Are they true now? What are we living out that is not true right now? And that's, that can be really, really tough work that someone has to kind of throw themselves into. But the benefits of doing that work and, being open to doing that are wonderful in terms of much healthier expression. As you said, you can express your anger and then where your boundaries are. Other people know where they stand with you. As you said, your emotions flow and all of that. So hard work, but really worth kind of digging down on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So this brings me on to my final point, which has to do with the two core responsibilities that we have in our relationship with anger. It's important to understand that emotions don't make our choices. Emotions are messengers from aspects of ourselves. Each emotion, as Carla says, and as that I firmly believe, each emotion has a purpose, and when it shows up for a reason. It has some information to give you. If you can then act on that information in the appropriate way for that feeling, then it will flow on. So it's important that we don't let our emotions make our choices. If we're afraid, then we understand our fear, we sit with it, we listen to its messages, but we take action that's appropriate anyway. We don't let that fear dictate our choices. In the same way, we don't let anger dictate our choices. It's not okay in terms of a functional, healthy adulthood to say, my anger made me do that. I just lashed out because of that thing he said, or she always does things like that, so I had to respond to that way. That's not actually true in terms of a functioning adulthood. That is allowing our emotions to dictate our choices. So the two kinds of responsibilities that we have here, one is to govern the self, to slowly over time strengthen the aspect of us that has a governing role, that sits in wise judgment of all the different aspects of us. So that might be our mind and its ability to process problems and come up with solutions, but also its kind of babble, its noise, its distraction. We need to govern that. We need to govern our feelings so that when they come up, we acknowledge and understand the messages that they're bringing. We need to govern these dramas and these stories that we're talking about early life things perhaps, or traumatic events that keep replaying in our lives. There we need to strengthen and empower an aspect of ourselves which has a wise and governing role over this. And the image and the language that tends to be really helpful around this is archetypal. So here we talk about the sovereign archetype. That might be a king or queen. We imagine a king or a queen sitting in a courtroom, being advised by all of these heckling voices on the floor. But the final decision always comes down to the sovereign. So this is an aspect of us that we empower and we enshrine. We connect with that feeling of strength, wisdom, judgment, discernment. And while we receive these messages from our feelings, we don't immediately act on them. We don't let that feeling dictate our actions. We don't let either the anger or the fear of anger or the embedded and enraged and perhaps hateful anger to make our decisions. We receive that as information, and then we strengthen this part of us that receives it, makes a wise and fair judgment, and then we take action. So that's our first responsibility, is to make sure that we are acting properly in our lives and not simply lashing out or expressing ourselves inappropriately or sabotaging situations and relationships because of the strength of the feelings we have. If our feelings are overwhelming us and they are making our choices, then we're trapped in an early life stage of our development. And that is simply a message that we need to do some work to develop ourselves, to strengthen our adulthood. David Rico's book, How to Be an Adult, has a lot of material about this. And I really invite you to reflect on this idea, this notion, this feeling of an archetypal sovereign within you that is making these wise choices. The other responsibility that we really have is to care for ourselves. Anger is there to protect you. It is there to give you gifts at moments when you need them most. So we have to learn to understand the way that it works. It isn't there just to make us fly off the handle or make us not be able to think clearly in difficult situations. It's actually there to protect us, restore our boundaries, and make sure that we're healthy and whole. So we have a responsibility to ourselves to understand that, to learn to let that energy and that fire flow and do its thing. If you feel an impulse to let it burn everything around you, to over-respond to it, then we also need to do some work there. But we have a responsibility to ourselves to make the most of anger, to benefit from its wisdom. So whether it is reading one of these books we're talking about today, or doing some personal development work, or even just doing some reflection, doing some journaling, as I've said, I have rediscovered and really benefiting from, then reflect on anger and begin to get its gifts and its wisdom, rather than being overwhelmed by it or paralyzed by it or entranced by it. This is really an invitation to move through your life with wisdom and discernment by paying more attention to what emotions are, how they function, what they're up to, So, yeah, so I just wanted to talk about that because this is about what do we then do with that anger? If we're in a situation where we lash out or we repress or we feel unwell because we're repressing so much anger, we're allowing so many boundaries to be overstepped in our lives, then that could be a real problem. So this is how we put it into action. We take responsibility for the way that we show up, the way that we respond to others, the way that we manage our anger in social situations, and we take responsibility for caring for ourselves by listening to anger and making use of it.
Thank you. Lovely, brilliant, great. Thank you very much. Okay, so my last piece, I'm going to talk about drama versus true anger. And as I said in my last point, I flagged this. Now, when I came across this notion of there's something called drama in relation to true anger, this was a real light bulb moment for me. So reading David Richo's book and in terms of my own sort of psychological understanding of myself and human beings, a light bulb got switched on. Oh, right. Okay. So this is really, I just think this is really kind of psychologically and emotionally intelligent stuff. So in my first bit, I gave a definition of what anger is. Now, in contrast, drama is an avoidance of true feeling, whereas anger is an acknowledgement of true feeling. So drama is an avoidance of true feeling. It's what we do when we can't cope with or manage difficult feelings. Instead, we lash out, we punish others, we try to belittle or humiliate another person, we apportion blame, we make judgments about other people. And David Richo describes drama as a kind of egocentric manipulative theatrics. And what it serves to do is, like I said, is deflect away from us acknowledging and addressing difficult emotions that we are experiencing. Now, when I was getting together material for this podcast, I thought of an example of this, quite a visceral example. So it must have been about a month ago. Me and my partner and her son were going out into the centre of Frome. We were going to go and get a pizza. And we came across this, all of a sudden, a car pulled up, swerved over to the wrong side of the road, wheels screeched, someone got out and started shouting at someone coming towards them, someone walking down the street, a couple of people, a woman with a child in particular. And then what followed was this sort of scene of, for about 10 or 15 minutes, lots of shouting, lots of abuse, lots of name calling. And for me, that was drama. It had there was obviously some kind of, discontent, some kind of oppositional stuff going on, some disagreement at the very least between these two parties. But there was no sense in which anyone in this whole exchange was getting to the bottom of anything meaningful in terms of true emotion and really understanding themselves, let alone understanding the other person. And it really did have this sense of an egocentric kind of theatrics. And it ended with some guy just getting back in the car, slamming the car door, driving off at speed, and then shouting some abusive things to the woman in the street. And, it was like, it was really, really striking as an example of, drama versus true anger being expressed and something getting sorted. Because I think what I'm learning here, Alexander, is that anger is, if it's about nothing else, it's actually about getting something sorted. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I just want to offer some things from David Richo's sort of comparison between drama and true anger. So I've just got 5 points, and these are, I think, invitations just to get people to think about their own responses and how anger functions for them and what happens when they see anger working out or working through. And some of this might be quite challenging or even counterintuitive. So the first point is, drama scares the hearer, whereas true anger informs the hearer and creates a tension in the hearer. So drama is about scaring someone, pushing someone away. Remember, it's all about deflection. It's all about denial. Whereas true anger is a form of communication. It's like you stake your flag in the ground and you say, hey, look, I'm here. This is important to me. Something matters here. I want to kind of, get back in contact with you, So there's that. Next point is drama. Drama is meant to silence the other person, whereas true anger is meant to communicate with the other person. So if you're in a situation where you're trying to shut someone up, then you can be pretty sure that you're in some sort of drama situation. You're not really trying to kind of communicate with someone, even if there is kind of strong emotion come up within you. Thirdly, drama blames the other for what you are feeling. Whereas true anger, as you were saying, Alexander, takes responsibility for this feeling as one's own. So again, there's a pattern here in terms of just trying to deflect, push onto, push away, and create distance, because what's come up for the person who's in a drama mode is just too difficult, too challenging to look at. Fourthly, drama is violent, aggressive, out of control, derisive, and punitive. Whereas true anger, Rico says, is non-violent, always in control, and within safe limits. Now, for me, that's quite challenging, and I think that's quite counterintuitive and quite countercultural, because I think we tend to link anger and violence. Now, I was so kind of not completely unsure about this, but I had to look up a definition of violence last night just to be clear for myself when I was talking about this. And one of the things about violence is that there's a deliberate intention to hurt. So I think you said from Carla McLaren that it never wants to, it's a social emotion, so hence this bit about trying to communicate, and this bit about it doesn't want to hurt anyone necessarily. So let's be clear here. Anger does have force. It does have vitality. It does have a kind of strength. It does have an upward moving kind of very physicalized kind of expression. But that is not designed to violate or hurt someone else. That's a protective, hey, my boundary's been crossed. I need to protect myself. I need to stand up here. So I think that's really, really important. But like I said, challenging stuff, some of this, and even quite counterintuitive. The last one is if you're in drama mode, then anger is held onto and it endures as resentment. Whereas true anger is brief and then let go of with a sense of closure. And I found that really helpful. So like when I've been learning this stuff, this whole stuff with my partner, I've really got this, that, anger is quite immediate. It doesn't linger. It doesn't hang around. It's short and sharp. The boundaries expressed. It doesn't linger. It doesn't hold resentment. Anger doesn't bear a grudge. So there are about 5 or 6 other points that David Rico highlights in terms of this delineation between drama and true anger. I didn't want to kind of overload everyone with all of those, because I just tried to pick out the ones that kind of spoke to me, and I think are kind of relatively straightforward to get hold of and relatively easy to separate one phenomenon, the drama, from the other phenomenon, the true anger.
Yeah, that's really great, Neil. Thank you. It's really practical and clear. I really appreciate the way you brought that. I've got one question, which I just appreciate your thoughts on. How would you say, if somebody realises, having listened to your description of the differences between drama and anger, if someone realises that they do tend towards drama rather than the healthy expression of anger, what do you think someone should do about that?
It's a good question. Thank you. My immediate response is some kind of mindful reflection. So I think it's really important with all of this. I think so much of what we talk about, Alexander, a vital ingredient is to stop, reflect, slow down, try and buy yourself some time, move away from the situation. You talked about journaling. Someone might want to write down an experience they went through. So I think that it's interesting. I think if you're in drama, then maybe there are some questions that you could ask yourself, like, is this getting me what I want? Is this serving the situation? Is it bringing me back into connection with the other person? am I expressing a true want, a true desire? So I think those are some sort of self-reflective questions that someone could ask themselves. And I think also paying attention to some of those last points I mentioned about, does it have a psychological energy of lingering, or is it clean cut? So do you have an experience of, if you're in drama, then there might be a sense of it really kind of dragging out, become elongated. There becomes a real tit for tat. So I think those things are the kind of warning signs.
Yeah.
And then, like I said, to try and take some time to step back, you could either say to the person that you're in some conflict with, say, hey, I think I'm a bit off center here, not managing this really well. Something's going on with me. Listen, let's take a time out. I need to go away and have a think. Whatever it is. But for me, a key ingredient is to slow yourself down, try and bring some self-reflective attention to your experience, and then maybe ask some of these questions like, is it serving me? Am I reconnecting with this person? Am I cleanly and clearly getting my point across? Those kinds of things.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Okay, that we have come to the end of episode 13 of the Big Yearning podcast for today. Hope you've enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed it. I think it's a really, really important topic, and maybe a very culturally topical one, with the amount of kind of discord and angst and kind of vitriol that there is in the world at the moment around a whole load of different things. So if me and you, Alexander, can contribute in any small way in this podcast to kind of help people to think about anger, then for me that's a good thing. Now, if people would want to get in touch with us, we very much welcome that. Like I said, this episode was based on a request from someone I think that spoke to you.
Yep.
And can we do a podcast on anger? So we very much welcome your requests. So what's the best way for people to get in touch with you, Alexander?
If you want to get in touch with me, then you can either visit my website, which is deepcoaching.co.uk, and you can drop me a message through that, or you can book a call with me through there. Or if you go on social media, if you go on Instagram, then my account is deep_coaching. Give me a follow, and I would love to hear from you, so drop me a message.
Thank you very much. Best way to get in touch with me is via my website, where my contact details are in terms of phone or email. And my website is www.coachingforlifefroome.co.uk. And the last thing to say is that our next episode 14 in 2 weeks' time, will be entitled Learning to Love Ourselves, which I very much look forward to. As soon as Alexander suggested that, I was already jotting down notes about what that might contain for me. I think it's going to be a goodie. Lovely. It's going to be a goodie. I think it's a really, really lovely and the opportunity there to be very broad, but very specific and kind of intimate as well.
Yeah,
so
agreed.
I look forward to that. But until that time, it's goodbye from me. See you next time.
And goodbye from me. Thanks very much for listening.